Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a political theory concept that is absolutely everywhere, but honestly so often misunderstood. I'm talking about secularism. You hear it tossed around on the news all the time, right? And it's super easy to just assume it means, being nice or having a general attitude of tolerance toward the folks living next door. But politically speaking, it is way, way bigger than that. Today, we're going to move beyond this simple idea of just mere tolerance, and we're going to pop the hood to look at the heavy machinery of how states actually manage massive, complex diversity.
So let's just get right into the thick of it. How does a democratic state ensure true equality when vastly different cultures and communities are forced to coexist within it? Really think about that for a second. Picture a single country with dozens of spoken languages, centuries-old religions, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Christianity, all packed tightly inside the exact same borders. When you have people with completely different beliefs, dietary habits, and core values sharing the same physical space, friction isn't just a possibility, it's pretty much a guarantee. So how on earth does a government treat everyone fairly without picking favorites? Well, the structural, theoretical answer to that giant puzzle is secularism.
Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, understanding religious domination. Second, defining a secular state. Third, the Western model. Fourth, the unique Indian model. And finally, criticisms of Indian secularism. Let's get started.
Section 1. Understanding religious domination. Because before we can even begin to understand how secularism works, we actually have to understand the specific threat it's trying to stop. The source text splits religious domination into two completely different types, and getting this difference is absolutely crucial. First up, we've got inter-religious domination. This is the one you probably picture when you hear religious conflict. One religious community persecuting or discriminating against a totally different one. But the text points out a second type that often gets completely ignored in Western debates, intra-religious domination, meaning oppression happening entirely inside the exact same religion. We're talking about frameworks that maybe systematically shut out women or ancient hierarchical practices, like barring certain castes such as Dalits from even entering temples. The text makes a really strong argument here. True secularism can't just stop at preventing riots between different faiths. It literally has to fight both types of domination to actually protect human dignity. And just to ground this in some stark reality, the source material gives us some very specific, tragic historical examples of interreligious persecution in India. It mentions the 1984 massacre in Delhi where over 2,700 Sikhs were killed. It talks about the thousands of Hindu Kashmiri pundits who were forced to flee their generational homes in the Kashmir Valley. And it points to the post-Godhra riots in Gujarat back in 2002, which resulted in over 1,000 deaths. So you see, secularism is not just some dry academic exercise for university halls. It is a vital, life-saving doctrine meant to stop these exact types of devastating events based purely on religious identity.
Moving on to Section 2, defining a secular state. We know how bad the problem of domination can be. So what actually makes a state equipped to solve it?
Well, to really define a secular state, we kind of have to define what it is definitely not. It is absolutely not a theocratic state. A theocratic state is run directly by a priestly order or clerics. There's zero separation between religion and politics. The holy texts literally write the civil laws. Think the papal states in medieval Europe, or, a Taliban-controlled state today. But here's the big takeaway from the text. Just because a state doesn't have priests running the government doesn't automatically mean it's secular. Picture a country with a normal parliament, but it heavily funds only one specific religion's temples and gives special tax breaks only to people of that one faith. Obviously, that leaves zero room for equality. So to be truly secular, a state must have absolutely no formal legal alliance with any religion whatsoever.
Okay, so how do countries actually pull off that level of separation? Let's check out Section 3, the Western model. The mainstream Western approach is basically the American model, which is all about strict mutual exclusion. This whole idea was built by groups fleeing state-sponsored religious persecution over in Europe, so their number one priority was keeping the individual safe from some giant state church. Because of that specific history, they built a massive strict wall between the state and religion, mutual exclusion. The state completely stays out of religious affairs, and religion completely stays out of state affairs. Under this model, your faith is 100% your private business. The government won't fund a religious school, but it also won't force a religion to change its internal rules, even if those internal rules happen to be heavily discriminatory. State-supported religious reform? Yeah, it basically has no place here.
Now, a strict wall sounds great in theory, but what happens when a society has massive, deep-rooted religious diversity that predates modern statehood by thousands of years? And that brings us to Section 4, the unique Indian model. When you zoom out and look at the whole globe, you see wildly different ways of handling this. We just talked about the US and its mutual exclusion, but then the text brings up a totally different historical extreme: Kemal Ataturk's Turkey in the early 20th century. Ataturk was determined to forcefully modernize his country, so he went with active suppression. The state aggressively intervened to literally ban traditional religious dress, like the fez. He basically shoved religion completely out of the public square. India went with a fascinating third path called principled distance. They didn't build a massive American wall, and they didn't actively suppress like Ataturk. Instead, the Indian state engages or disengages flexibly based on the situation. It steps in to ban oppressive practices when it has to, but then steps back to protect minority rights, all with the ultimate goal of promoting overall equality.
This incredibly nuanced philosophy was championed by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. He said, "A secular state protects all religions, but does not favor one at the expense of others, and does not itself adopt any religion as the state religion." For Nehru, secularism absolutely did not mean hating religion, like Ataturk kind of did in Turkey. Instead, it meant fiercely opposing communalism. And in this context, communalism is the dangerous political game of using religious identity to pit people against each other just to gain power. Nehru's vision was brilliant because it let the state step in for necessary social reforms without completely trampling on people's deeply held faith. All of this translates into some very distinctive functional features for the Indian model. Because of its specific history, Indian secularism targets both interreligious and intra-religious domination. Like, the state actually intervened legally to ban untouchability. That's a massive internal reform. Plus, unlike the American model that solely focuses on the individual, Indian secularism specifically protects community-based rights. For instance, allowing religious minorities to run their own educational institutions. Why does that matter? Because without that protection, a minority culture's language and traditions could just get completely swallowed up by whatever the majority culture is doing. It's not a rigid wall. It's a highly sophisticated, flexible balancing act.
But of course, anytime you have a system trying to balance that many competing interests, people are going to push back. Let's get into our final section: criticisms of Indian secularism and how the source text actually answers them.
The very first criticism you'll constantly hear is this: is Indian secularism just an unsuited Western import? Did they really just copy-paste a Western constitutional idea into a highly spiritual society where it totally doesn't belong? The text gives a very firm no. Think about what India actually looked like right at independence compared to the West. The West was pretty homogeneous. Maybe they were trying to keep the peace between a few different sects of Christianity, which is why they obsessed over separating church and state. But India was dealing with massive demographic diversity, ancient caste systems, and fundamentally different worldviews that had shared the same land for centuries. You literally couldn't just copy-paste the Western model. India took the core concept of equality but completely customized it for its own reality. They focused on peaceful coexistence between wildly different groups and actually reforming internal religious hierarchies. So no, it's not a Western import at all. It's a completely indigenous evolution.
Okay, the next criticism is definitely the most debated one out there. Is Indian secularism guilty of minoritism? Basically, by going so far out of its way to protect minority rights, is the state actually being unfair and just ignoring what the majority wants? To answer that, the text drops this brilliant, super relatable analogy. Picture this: you're sitting in a small enclosed train compartment with 4 passengers. Passenger 1 really wants to smoke a cigarette. Passengers 2 and 3, they're totally neutral, they don't care. But passenger 4 has severe asthma. So they decide to settle it democratically with a quick vote. The smoker votes yes, the neutral folks abstain, and the asthmatic desperately votes no. Well, the majority wins, and the smoker lights up. But let's pause and actually ask ourselves, was that simple majority vote actually fair? For the passenger with asthma, that smoke isn't just annoying. It's a literal life-threatening attack on their fundamental right to breathe. The text uses this to highlight a massive limit to democracy. When a fundamental interest of survival or basic dignity is on the line, just doing a simple democratic head count is completely inappropriate. Just like that asthmatic needs undeniable protection from the smoker, minority communities need robust, rock-solid constitutional protection to safeguard their fundamental interests against the overwhelming weight of the majority. And that train story leads perfectly into the single most important conceptual difference in this entire explainer: formal equality versus substantive equality. Imagine there's an auditorium on the first floor, but the only way up is a steep staircase. Under formal equality, everyone is treated exactly the same, right? The door is open, you can buy a ticket, and you're free to use the stairs. But what if you're elderly or you use a wheelchair? In that case, treating you exactly the same is actually massive discrimination. True, substantive equality means recognizing that people are starting from entirely different positions, which means you have to build a wheelchair ramp. And here's the kicker: that ramp is not some unfair special privilege. It is a necessary accommodation so everyone can actually get inside the building. In a diverse society, minority rights are literally that wheelchair ramp.
Which leaves us with this final, really powerful question to chew on. Does treating everyone exactly the same truly guarantee equality, or does real justice sometimes require special accommodation? The source material makes a pretty incredible case that a truly secular state doesn't just put on a blindfold and enforce a rigid uniformity. Instead, it actively navigates all our differences, stepping in to stop oppression and stepping back to protect unique identities, all to ensure true, substantive equality for absolutely everyone. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I hope this gave you a completely new perspective on the intricate mechanics behind secularism.